This episode is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, October 2004. It is the run-up to the 2004 election, Bush versus Kerry, and the messaging campaign is really heating up. We've talked about some of the stuff from this election year before. I think we did episodes about some of the debates, the ads, the voting machines, the Swift voting. We actually haven't done the Swift vote thing, and I think maybe we'll wait till next year to do that. But today, let's talk about one really interesting wrinkle in the 2004 election. A letter-writing campaign in which thousands of people signed up to send letters to swing voters in Clark County, Ohio, a critical swing county in a critical swing state. And these letters were encouraging them to vote for John Kerry, the Democrat. And who was organizing this letter-writing campaign? The Guardian, a left-leaning British newspaper. In the end, there were more than 10,000 Brits signing up to send letters trying to swing an American election. It was known as Operation Clark County, and let's talk about how it was ultimately responsible for winning John Kerry the 2004 election. And wait a minute, no, I'm told that is not the case. Bush carried Clark County and was reelected in 2004, but let's discuss it anyway. A really fascinating moment. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Governor.
Oh, no. Yeah, that's how they started those letters, and then it just all went haywire from there, right? Wait a minute.
Hey there.
So I don't think we need to do a ton of table setting here in terms of Clark County, really important. Ohio, like, until, I guess, sort of recently, but like Ohio for ever the swingy of swingy states,
state,
right?
Yeah.
And in 2000 and 2004, it was basically like everything runs through Ohio. It was all about capturing the razor's edge in Ohio. So that's the larger context here. Let's go to the letter writing campaign itself and then talk about kind of what it tells us about very interesting 2004 election. But who cooked this idea up?
A man named Ian Katz, who was a features editor for The Guardian. He wrote a column just kind of introducing this operation. And the context of it is the UK was caught up in all of the shenanigans and bad decisions of the Bush administration, including the invasion of Iraq. And that had rattled British people pretty significantly. There had been massive anti-war movements in London and across Britain to try to stop them from joining the war, and yet they joined anyway. And so Katz is writing this idea in The Guardian. He writes that British political life may now be at least as heavily influenced by White House policy as by the choices of UK voters. So they felt like their lives were being shaped by and their fates determined by U.S. elections, even more so than their own elections, and that they should have a say in what's happening in the U.S.
Yeah. I mean, it's wild to me that Bush's approval ratings are so low. It's like 22% in the UK or something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is this the same year where like the Dixie Chicks go over and say that they're like disappointed in their president or something, and they do it in UK soil, and then people are all upset about that? That's another side note. That's another episode.
But that is another
Yes.
episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all part of the milieu here. And I mean, I take his point. I think politics, especially between the U.S. and the U.K., have always been intertwined, but especially around the Iraq War, it is really the dominant story, and it is an international story. So I get the investment in the U.S. election and the genuine feeling of that. There's also, and I have a number of sort of thoughts about kind of this particular moment in American politics and media and kind of layering into this specific act. One of them is this is a moment in 2004 where I do think this idea of the like politics and especially elections, a spectator sport is kind of a little bit in there. And that's not to like disparage the genuine effort here to like swing an election, but there is this idea that like we can gamify this, we can dip in, there is something we can do, there is a little lever that we can pull here, right? And I can just sort of watching it from thousands of miles away and saying, oh, this is for us. We can get in on this. It's an interesting kind of, I think, somewhat modern instinct for regular people. So that's part of it too.
Well, and that there's a technology that has made it possible, because 2004, remember, is probably the first election where they're really pioneering the small dollar donations using the internet. Howard Dean is on the forefront of this in the 2004 Democratic primaries. And so one of the things that the paper encourages is for people in Britain to donate to the NAACP's Get Out the Vote efforts. And that's something they can do thanks to these new systems that both allow them to know immediately what's happening in the United States, but also to get involved, whether it is by letter writing, more old-fashioned technology, or by these donations.
I mean, this is why I feel a little torn, because in some ways I feel like I approve of a letter writing campaign. Love a letter writing campaign.
It's always been part of politics. Right?
Yeah, I feel like it's a sort of an OG tried and true way of like reaching the people. And this is like pre-bots, right? Pre like this moment where you have sort of an infiltration where people can sort of come in and they flood your social media or your email or what have you with all of these different ideas and propaganda. But to me, I feel still a little conflicted in the sense that like this is an outside force that is coming in very sort of undiplomatically or officially undiplomatically and saying like, hey, here's who we want. And we're going to put our efforts behind this person.
Yeah.
One might call it foreign interference in a U.S. election. And it's not that, right?
I mean, that's what I'm getting at.
Like, it's not that, because it's like ordinary people who are writing letters and just saying, like, they're not, trying to flood the zone with misinformation. They're just saying, hey, this is what we want. I mean, I think that the miscalculation, and Katz even writes about this a little bit in his piece, like, do voters in Clark County, Ohio, which is a swing state, want British people writing them and saying, well, we think that you're doing it wrong and that you need to vote for John Kerry. He's our man. John Kerry, who was already being painted by his Republican opponents as this kind of like effete European guy. And so it was also not sure how this is going to play out on the ground.
Execution is always the sort of key thing, right? But what you just said sort of is where I think it ties into me to this sort of rise of the gamification of elections, because I think that in undergirding a lot of this is not just an emotional appeal to someone or a policy appeal to someone, but is this notion that like these are dots on a map, and all we need to do is move a bunch of dots from the red enough dots from the red to the blue, right? And all it takes is just a little bit of a nudge, and we can optimize that through the internet and through this letter writing. And it's like, lost in all of that is the notion that this is like a real human being who makes decisions for all sorts of complicated reasons. You can't just algorithmically figure out how to move them from one camp to the other. That's in this sauce as well, and it's just why in the execution of it, for other reasons as well, it just doesn't land. Like if no one, I don't think, as part of this campaign kind of stopped and thought about what would happen if you got a letter like this in the mail. What would you actually think? What would it do? Would it actually change your mind?
And Jody, I love this idea of gamification, because it's also at this moment, the other big technology change is this is the first presidential election where you have three pretty robust cable news networks. They were around in 96 and 2000, but they were MSNBC and Fox News were still very small. But by 2004, now you have the language of red states versus blue states. Barack Obama famously talks about them in his 2004 speech. But you also have the technology of those big boards that they have up on election night, where you're not just looking at the different states, but they like zoom down into the various counties with this like Karl Rovian, like, oh, well, the demographics of Clark County are X, Y, and Z. And, oh, well, Al Gore won it by 1%. And if Kerry moves 400 votes, he can win it by X amount. And so that kind of like very granular and yet very abstract statistical approach. This is the election where that is really getting baked in.
It's granular, but not on the ground, right? Which is really interesting.
Exactly.
Yes.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I want to get back to the letter writing campaign, but, it is important to point out that the campaigns have always done this too, right? I mean, a lot of, campaigns have always been at the leading edge of this. And so I don't want to sort of gloss over the fact that campaigns think about splicing and dicing voters and nudging people across and, manipulating people for, good and bad intentions. And so, part of this story, I mean, Niki, you're right. It's complicated because part of this story is also just like average people should be able to get in the mix on that too. We shouldn't just have, lobbyists and PACs and so forth thinking about tipping points and so forth. Why wouldn't we, but it's everyone is sort of embracing that language and so forth. But again, execution is everything. So coming back to this letter writing campaign, 11,000 Guardian readers across Britain sign up and they start writing these letters. And we have some examples of the flowery language that goes into some of these letters, including from some famous people.
Yeah, I mean, John Le Carre wrote a letter, the spy novelist who died, I think last year, maybe earlier this year, writes one of these letters. So now you have like this famous British person who writes, probably no American president in all history has been so universally hated abroad as George W. Bush for his bullying unilateralism, his dismissal of international treaties, his reckless indifference to the aspirations of other nations and cultures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It has this beautiful lyricism to it. It does also read like something you might read in the newspaper as opposed to kind of a heartfelt reaching out to a voter based on what their needs might be. But I mean, if I got a letter from John Le Carre, I'd feel pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Or you may have no clue who he is, and you might be like this one woman in Ohio who thought she was getting a letter from a terrorist and threw it out.
The very first letter that arrives in Clark County, it's to a Kerry supporter of all people, this woman named Beverly Cole. She throws it in the trash because she's like, this is sketchy.
It could be an anthrax letter.
Yeah, exactly.
I know.
And the letters kind of fall short. There's also pushback, which we'll get to, and a kind of, what's the word, backlash, or like, what's the phrase, rat fucking, is that the phrase? But there's
rat fucking is the word you're looking for, yes.
There's
in
some,
fact, Roger Stone was probably involved.
There's some shenanigans going on in response to this. So like, obviously conservative media, we have an emerging conservative blogosphere in this moment. Niki knows this scene is better than anyone in the world, I would say, but they're pushing back, they're making fun of this effort for sure, but it goes a little bit beyond that too, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're not just making fun of it, although to be sure, this is grist for the mill for this right-wing blogosphere, which is pretty powerful in the 2000s. This is really where the base is living in a pre-social media era. But they're also getting involved. So they pretend to be lefty Brits, and they get the paper to hand over addresses for some of these voters. And then a hacker manages to shut down the paper's internet sign-up page. So they go in and they both want to destroy it by sending pretty terrible letters to these voters, but also by just making it unmanageable. Oh, you want to write these letters and have these addresses? Well, now you can't use the internet.
Yeah.
So
sabotage.
Yeah.
Sabotage. Yeah.
That also ties into, I think, a moment, and this is a little later, but, roughly in the same period I was getting my start in journalism too. And I did a lot of projects that were online, crowdsourcing, bringing people together. And there is an earnestness to that. And I remember the first time I kind of set up a forum online where people can share their stories. And this is great. We're going to connect people. And then someone shows up and just messes with it, and does something awful or hacks it or just kind of doesn't take it seriously. And you just kind of have this deflating piercing of your earnestness, and you're whether it's to joke around or out of malintent, you're opening yourself up to get screwed with. And I feel is also part of this story is a little the scales coming off of the promise of the internet a little bit to be a force for earnest good.
Maybe one scale.
The scales fully came off over the next decade or so.
Yes.
But yes,
over the next decade, no scales left.
No scales left.
Although, can I ask the question that I just feel like should be the most obvious one, which is has anyone gotten a letter in the mail and be like, you changed my mind, I'm gonna go vote for Kerry now, or I'm voting for Bush now? For people who are really on the fence, how much of this is an influence in their decision? I don't think very much at all.
This is a really good question because postcarding has become, once again, like very, very popular among movements like Indivisible and other groups. Like one of the big things that they did was they would have like postcarding parties where you would write postcards to voters and explain why you were voting the way that you were voting. And so it was both this personal appeal. But also, I think that the calculation, to your point, Kellie, changes a little bit because it's less about changing people's minds and more about getting people motivated enough to go vote. So that I'm not quite sure that that's where the Guardian readers were coming from in their letters. But that, I think, is the way that the technology is being used now. Like the text you get spammed with are not trying to convince you to vote for a candidate. They're trying to make sure that you show up and vote for the candidate.
And, and Kellie used that word influence. I think that's the right word. It's an amalgamation of a bunch of factors that just leads you on election day. There's all sorts of political science research that shows it's like, the most important thing is like whether it's raining that day, or like whether your neighbor knocks on your door and says, "Hey, I'm going to the polling station like right now. You coming with me?" But
how long are the lines?
But that accumulation of all that stuff you've been sort of hit with over the previous months, you never know which is the one that's going to kind of like be the straw that pushes you in one direction or another. So that's the sort of way to think about this, which means in a sort of inverted way, like, everything is really important. Nothing's important, but also everything's important because anything could be the thing. So, I guess there's a version of the story where it is. That letter could have been the thing that tipped or that influenced, maybe not in that moment. But yes, I mean, this is all very murky, which I find real solace in. Like, I think people are really complicated and make decisions for all sorts of complicated reasons. And I kind of, I like that about human beings, even when I don't like the results of that decision. But speaking of results, so we have Clark County, Ohio, very important, swingy county. I guess we should say in 2000, Al Gore won it by 324 votes, but it was like very clearly identified as a very important county here. These letters come in. The Republican Party chairman is quoted as saying, "This is a very competitive county where the undecided vote is very small. What the Guardian has done is firm up the Republican base. What a gift!" Because there's a backlash here. There's the people are starting to get motivated, as Niki was saying, in the other direction by saying, "Look at this absurd interference coming in here." And so then on election day, what ends up happening?
Swing County did what a swing county is going to do, which it swung from Al Gore to George W. Bush, who ends up winning Clark County by 1,620 votes, which is about what combined Al Gore and Ralph Nader had received in Clark County in 2000. So it swung the other way. It was also the only county that Gore had won in 2000 in Ohio that Kerry lost. So
That's
it becomes like even
statistic.
more emblematic.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild to me. That's wild.
And this guy, Ian Katz, to return to him as we wrap up, he wrote a piece, I think before the election, basically saying like, well, this was a bust, and he says, I think
guys, it's not working.
He's a good writer. He says, I think I have an idea as to how Dr. Frankenstein felt. But yes, his creation had run amok, and he didn't realize that there would be a huge media brouhaha, as he put it. And he then, after the election, says, the only thing that's completely clear is that we didn't get Kerry elected, and nobody's going to be hiring me as a political strategist. So there you go.
Fair enough.
Maybe stay in your lane.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, this is super, super fascinating. I think the 2004 election is about as interesting as it gets. But
totally.
We will leave it there, and I'm sure we'll return to this election in the coming months as we head towards another election. But for now, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer. Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia. From